They were searching for one ghost and stumbled into another. Deep in Lake Ontario, beneath centuries of silence, an underwater drone descended into darkness. What it found was impossible. A ship standing upright on the lakebed, masts reaching toward the surface like skeletal fingers frozen in time. No one knows her name. No one knows how long she's been waiting. But after more than a century in total darkness, she's finally been seen again. It began as a routine search mission in the summer of 1973. A team of researchers had gone into Lake Ontario looking for historic shipwrecks, vessels lost to the violent autumn storms that rake across the Great Lakes every year. They had coordinates. They had historical shipping manifests. They knew what kinds of losses to expect. The Great Lakes were known graves, documented in maritime records, mourned by families, marked on charts as casualties of waters that showed no mercy. Finding any of these wrecks would have been a victory for historical preservation, a chance to close century-old cases and bring clarity to tragedies long buried beneath the waves. But the lakebed had other plans. At a depth that remains carefully protected, coordinates restricted to prevent looters and salvage operations, the team's sonar picked up shapes that didn't match anything in the modern shipping records. They were larger, older, and impossibly intact. The signal was clear, too clear. Modern shipwrecks in the Great Lakes often show signs of collapse, scattering, or damage from decades of shifting ice and seasonal temperature changes. These didn't. The sonar return showed unified structures, vertical lines extending upward from the lakebed in a way that shouldn't have been possible. When the underwater equipment was deployed, the first images sent back to the surface were so clear, so undisturbed, that the crew thought their instruments had malfunctioned. There, standing on the bottom of Lake Ontario, were vessels with their masts still vertical, not broken, not collapsed, but standing as if they'd been lowered gently into place and simply left there. The hull showed no signs of catastrophic damage, no gaping holes from collision, no scorching from fire, no scattering of timbers that would indicate a violent breakup in a storm. The deck structures were visible, with railings still in place, and sections of rigging draped across the spars like frozen spider webs. And the rigging, preserved in the cold freshwater, hung motionless in the current like frozen ropes of time itself. One of the researchers later described the moment as stepping into a photograph from 1812. The wrecks weren't just intact, they were pristine, as if the ships had been sailing one moment and resting on the bottom the next, with no transition, no violence, no chaos in between. The discovery was reported to Canadian and American naval authorities within hours. By late 1973, the first detailed surveys had reached archaeologists and historians on both sides of the border. Preliminary assessments were made, experts were consulted, historical records were cross-referenced, and then the identification came. These were warships, the USS Hamilton and USS Scourge, lost during the War of 1812 in a sudden nighttime squall on August 8, 1813. But the discovery raised more questions than it answered. These weren't just commercial vessels that had quietly disappeared. These were naval ships, lost with crews aboard in a documented battle theater. Their sinking had been witnessed by other vessels in the squadron. Survivors had been pulled from the water. Reports had been filed. And yet, for 160 years, no one had found them. The discovery wasn't just another wreck. It was a portal into a moment of history that had been sealed off, untouched, for over a century and a half. A moment when these ships, with crews aboard, missions to complete, a war to fight, simply stopped existing in the world above and became part of the world below. The most haunting part, despite the documented sinking, despite the naval records, despite the witness accounts, the ships themselves had vanished so completely that their exact location remained a mystery for generations. The equipment continued its survey, circling the wreck slowly, capturing images from every angle. The wooden planking of the hulls appeared tight, well maintained, suggesting the ships were relatively new when they went down. The masts rose in perfect alignment, their tops still intact. No signs of the snapping or splintering that would indicate a storm-driven capsize. And then the survey descended lower, lights sweeping across the decks. Hatches were closed. Rigging was secured. Everything was in order. The kind of order you'd expect on ships at anchor, not ships at the bottom of a lake. It was as if the crews had simply walked away. But the ships themselves are only the beginning of the mystery. Lake Ontario is deceptive. To those who've never sailed her, she looks calm. A massive inland sea stretching between Canada and the United States, glittering under summer skies. Her shoreline dotted with cities and ports that seem safe, civilized, modern. But mariners from the War of 1812 era knew better. They called the Great Lakes the graveyard of ships, and Lake Ontario earned that title over and over again. The wrecks now resting on her floor are from this era, specifically 1813, during the height of naval warfare on the Great Lakes. The Hamilton and Scourge were armed schooners, converted merchant vessels pressed into military service to fight for control of Lake Ontario. Control of the lakes meant control of the war's outcome. The British and Americans both understood this. Whoever commanded Lake Ontario could move troops and supplies freely, attack enemy positions at will, and cut off reinforcements. It was a naval arms race fought on freshwater, with hastily converted merchant ships serving as makeshift warships. The Hamilton had been a commercial schooner named Diana before the U.S. Navy purchased her in 1812 and armed her with cannons. The Scourge had been the merchant vessel Lord Nelson before similar conversion. Neither was built for naval combat. They were merchant ships forced into military roles, fast, maneuverable, but vulnerable. On the night of August 8, 1813, both ships were part of Commodore Isaac Chauncey's American squadron. Anchored off Fort Niagara, after a day of maneuvering against the British fleet, the weather had been calm. The crews were at rest, many sleeping below deck. Then, without warning, a sudden squall struck. These storms are Lake Ontario's signature killer, sudden, violent windstorms that can appear in minutes, driven by the collision of cold air masses from Canada, with warmer, moisture-laden air rising from the lake's surface. Wind speeds can jump from calm to 50 or 60 miles per hour in moments. Waves build to 10 feet or more. Visibility drops to zero. And ships caught unprepared can capsize before crews even reach the deck. Historical accounts from surviving American vessels describe the squall hitting like a wall. The Hamilton and Scourge, already carrying the weight of cannons that made them top-heavy, were knocked onto their sides by the sudden wind. Water poured through open hatches and gun ports. The ships filled in seconds. Sailors trapped below deck never had a chance. Those on deck were thrown into the black, churning water, miles from shore, in the middle of the night. Nearby ships in the American squadron managed to rescue 16 survivors total. But over 80 men went down with the Hamilton and Scourge. By dawn, both ships had vanished beneath the surface. Naval records documented the loss. Letters were sent to families. The squadron moved on, and the war continued. But the location of the wrecks remained unknown for 160 years. Lake Ontario is freshwater, and that changes everything. In saltwater, shipworms and marine organisms devour wooden hulls within decades. The Titanic, resting in the North Atlantic, is being consumed by metal-eating bacteria that will reduce her to rust stains within another century. Wooden wrecks in the ocean rarely last more than 50 years before they're scattered into splinters and sediment. But in the cold, oxygen-depleted depths of the Great Lakes, wood can last for centuries. The low temperature slows bacterial decay. The lack of salinity prevents the growth of organisms that feed on organic material. The minimal currents mean debris doesn't scatter. The result is a kind of underwater suspended animation, ships frozen at the moment of their death, waiting. And the Hamilton and Scourge? They didn't just sink, they settled. The fact that their masts are still standing, upright, undisturbed, tells the story of how they went down. When a top-heavy ship capsizes in a squall, it can roll completely over, trap air in the hull, and sink upside down or on its side. But if it fills with water rapidly while still upright, it can descend straight down, settling on the bottom in a near-perfect vertical orientation. That's what happened here. The ships filled through open hatches and gun ports. The weight of the cannons pulled them down evenly. They sank quickly, but vertically, until they touched the lakebed at approximately 300 feet. The masts, still attached, remained upright as the hulls settled into the silt. It's the kind of sinking that happens when a ship is already doomed, but hasn't been destroyed. When there's no time to react, no time to close hatches, no time to cut away masts to prevent capsizing. The crews knew they were going down. Historical accounts from survivors describe men struggling in the water, calling for help, clinging to floating debris. But in the dark, in a storm, rescue was nearly impossible. Many drowned within minutes. The cold water of Lake Ontario, even in August, rarely warmer than 60 degrees Fahrenheit at the surface and much colder below, induces hypothermia rapidly. Even strong swimmers lose consciousness within 15 to 30 minutes, so the ships carried them down. They sank quietly, deliberately almost, and then the lake kept them. For 160 years, they stood on the bottom, masts pointing toward a surface they would never reach again. Their decks empty, their cannons silent, their crews still aboard, sailors who never received a proper burial, never had their names inscribed on monuments, never came home. The survey lights swept across the rigging one more time, illuminating the ropes and canvas that once caught the wind and drove them forward. Now they hung still, swaying gently in the lake's slow current, like the curtains of a theater long after the final performance has ended. Yet what was found inside these wrecks was even more unexpected. Every shipwreck is a time capsule, but not all of them preserve the smallest, most human details. These do, though strict archaeological protocols have limited artifact removal. Surveys of the wrecks have revealed something historians rarely see: structural integrity so complete that the ship's interior spaces, cabins, holds, deck fittings, even the positions of cannons, remain visible and largely intact. Somewhere in those dark compartments are the lives of the people who sailed them. Naval records and logs from other ships in the squadron tell us the crew's names, their ranks, their assignments, but the ships themselves hold evidence of their final moments. Personal effects, boots, clothing, tools, weapons, remain where they last used. A sailor's knife, still at a workstation, rope coiled and ready, cannons secured in their mounts, loaded and ready for action that never came. These objects aren't treasures in the conventional sense. They have no monetary value, but they're priceless because they're proof. Proof that real people lived aboard these ships, fought aboard these ships, died aboard these ships. The cannons themselves tell a story. The Hamilton and Scourge were armed with a mix of carronades and long guns, short-range, large-bore cannons designed for close combat. These weapons made the ships effective in battle, but also dangerously top-heavy. Adding several tons of iron to the upper decks of a converted merchant schooner compromised stability. When the squall hit and the ships heeled over, the weight of those cannons accelerated the capsize. It was a design flaw born of necessity. The U.S. Navy needed armed vessels on Lake Ontario immediately, and there was no time to build purpose-designed warships. So they converted what they had, and men died because of it. Cargo and supplies remain in the holds. Barrels, shot, provisions for a crew at war. The galley, where meals were prepared, still contains cooking equipment. The crew quarters, cramped and dark even in daylight, now rest in permanent night. And the bodies. Many remain aboard, out of respect for the dead and in accordance with international conventions on underwater grave sites. The Hamilton and Scourge have been designated war graves. No artifacts have been removed. No human remains have been disturbed. The ships are protected under both U.S. and Canadian law, and diving on them without authorization is prohibited. They are monuments now, not museums. Even without physical recovery, the wrecks speak. The standing masts are memorials. The intact hulls are graves. And the silence surrounding them honors the men who never came home. Sailors who served their country, followed orders, and paid the ultimate price in a war fought on waters that showed no mercy. The lake holds their names. Naval records preserve their service. And the ships themselves stand as silent witnesses to a night in 1813, when the weather killed more Americans than the British ever could. They simply disappeared from the surface world and became part of the lakebed. And now these silent witnesses continue to speak. Discovering a shipwreck is one thing, protecting it is another. The exact coordinates of the Hamilton and Scourge have never been released to the public. A deliberate decision by Canadian and American authorities to prevent unauthorized diving, artifact theft, and site disturbance. Under international maritime law and bilateral agreements between the US and Canada, these wrecks are protected heritage sites and war graves, and tampering with them carries serious legal consequences. But the law can only do so much when the sites are underwater, unguarded, and technically accessible to anyone with the right equipment. That's where the technical challenge begins. Lake Ontario's depth varies wildly. Some areas are shallow enough for recreational divers. Others plunge to over 800 feet. The Hamilton and Scourge rest at approximately 300 feet, far beyond the reach of recreational diving. Recreational scuba diving is generally limited to depths of 130 feet. Beyond that, nitrogen narcosis, a condition caused by breathing compressed nitrogen at depth, can impair judgment, slow reaction time, and lead to fatal mistakes. Technical divers using mixed gases like trimix or heliox can go deeper, but they need extensive training, specialized equipment, and support teams. At 300 feet, these wrecks are effectively inaccessible to anyone except professional archaeologists and ROV operators, which means any study requires ROVs, remotely operated vehicles, equipped with high-resolution cameras, sonar mapping systems, and robotic arms capable of delicate work. The same technology used to explore the Titanic and other deep-sea wrecks. Modern ROVs can descend to depths far beyond human reach, transmitting live video and sonar data to operators on the surface. They can hover in place, rotate 360 degrees, and navigate tight spaces inside wrecks. Their cameras can document details invisible to the human eye from a surface vessel. But even with the technology, there's a responsibility that goes beyond documentation. Freshwater preserves wood, yes, but only as long as the environment remains stable. If the wrecks are disturbed, if sediment is moved, if oxygen-rich water floods sealed interior spaces, the entire structure could begin to decay rapidly. Wood exposed to light and oxygen after 160 years in darkness can deteriorate within months. Conservation isn't just about recovery. It's about leaving things undisturbed when that's the best option. The Hamilton and Scourge will never be raised. The cost would be astronomical, the structural risk too high, and the ethical implications too significant. These are war graves, not museum exhibits. Instead, they've been documented, mapped, and studied in place. The resulting research has been published, images have been archived, and the historical record has been enriched, all without disturbing the ships or the sailors who rest within them. And then there's the legal question. Who owns these ships? Under international conventions, including principles later formalized in UNESCO's 2001 Underwater Cultural Heritage Protocols, shipwrecks of historical and cultural significance are considered shared human heritage. The Hamilton and Scourge are jointly managed by the U.S. Navy as the original owner, and the city of Hamilton, Ontario, in whose waters they rest, and after which one was named. No private salvage company can claim the wrecks for profit. They belong to history. Lake Ontario straddles the U.S.-Canadian border. The Hamilton and Scourge rest in Canadian waters, but they are American naval vessels. This required diplomatic agreements to establish shared stewardship and protection protocols, agreements that serve as a model for cross-border underwater heritage preservation. These frameworks ensure that future discoveries are protected, not plundered, because what we do with these wrecks will set the precedent for how we treat the thousands of others that still wait in the deep. The Great Lakes hold an estimated 8,000 to 10,000 shipwrecks. Only a fraction have been identified. Many rest in depths that make exploration costly and dangerous. Others are buried under silt, invisible to sonar. And some, like the Hamilton and Scourge, stood waiting in the dark for over a century and a half, until technology and chance converged. Maritime historians continue to comb through 19th century shipping records, insurance claims, newspaper archives, and lighthouse logs. Each discovery adds another piece to the puzzle, another name to the list of known losses, another story recovered from silence. The Hamilton and Scourge are no longer mysteries. We know their names, we know their crews, we know how and when they sank. But thousands of other wrecks remain unidentified. Merchant ships, fishing vessels, passenger steamers, all lost to the lake's unforgiving nature. Each one represents lives interrupted, families left waiting, stories never finished. The standing masts of the Hamilton and Scourge are monuments not just to their own crews, but to every sailor who crossed these waters and never made it home. Dr. Daniel Nelson, a maritime historian who worked on the early surveys, noted that the Great Lakes are unique in their preservation capacity. Nowhere else in the world can you find wooden shipwrecks from the early 1800s in this condition. He explained, "The cold, fresh water creates a kind of museum without walls. These ships are teaching us things we could never learn from documents alone. The mast configurations, the rigging styles, the cannon placements, all of these details are visible in the survey footage. And all of them are lessons in naval architecture, military strategy, and the realities of frontier warfare. But identification and documentation are only part of the story. Protection is the other. Shipwrecks are fragile. Even without human interference, they're subject to slow decay, shifting sediment, and environmental changes. Invasive species like zebra mussels have colonized parts of the Great Lakes, and while they haven't significantly affected the Hamilton and Scourge Isles, at their depth, shallower wrecks have been encrusted and altered. Climate change is also a factor. Water temperatures in the Great Lakes have been rising slowly, which could accelerate biological activity and decay rates. Monitoring these wrecks over time will help scientists understand how environmental changes affect underwater heritage sites. For now, the Hamilton and Scourge remain in situ, undisturbed, protected, honored. They are monuments to the sailors who served, to the war they fought, and to the unforgiving power of the lakes that claimed them. The mystery isn't about their names anymore. It's about what they can still teach us. And somewhere beneath the cold, dark waters of Lake Ontario, two ships stand watch over a story that continues to unfold. A story of courage, sacrifice, and the thin line between history and oblivion. Respect the past, protect the deep, and never stop searching. Because the Great Lakes still hold thousands of untold stories, waiting in the darkness for their moment to return to the light.